Hello, and as this time we come now to the 22nd Sunday of this church year, which we are following the B schedule, which is the Markan tradition. We have, as you remember, over the last 6 weeks, been listening to sections of the Gospel according to John, particularly the 6th chapter, known as the Bread of Life chapter. And as I mentioned earlier on, since we are following Mark this year, he is of the 4 Gospels the shortest in terms of material, and in order to make it reach out through the 52 weeks of the church year, needed to fill in with those sections from John's Gospel. So once again, this time, we are back to Mark, and we pick up Mark in chapter 7, and we'll be hearing verses 1 through 8, verses 14 through 15, and verse 23. The first 2 verse readings, the first comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, and verse 6 through 8. And finally, we're going to begin to listen to the letter of James. And so this time, it's James chapter 1, verses 17 through 18, verses 21b through 22, and verse 27. So as we've noticed on a number of occasions, certain editing goes on in the presentation of what is offered for our consideration each week. So, although we are only hearing sections of chapter 7 of Mark's Gospel this time, what perhaps we need to look at is the total and examine a little bit why certain sections have been left out. So beginning in chapter 7, verses 1 through 23. Now, in these stories, and one we remember in the Gospel of Mark, that much of the material that Mark presents pictures Jesus as an actor, as something happening, and then, and perhaps he works a miracle or a sign. This is, in a certain way, what we're looking at this time, somewhat interesting, because Jesus talks for the first 17 of the 23 verses that make up this section. So this is interesting. Although certainly Mark presents Jesus as a teacher, he does not, as we've noticed when we looked at the parables earlier on in chapter 4, does not emphasize the material of Jesus' teaching to a great degree. This time, Jesus is going to be confronting the scribes and the Pharisees. And one will notice that there is this tension between these 2 groups. Now, I mention again, and I have to be very careful about this, that when we describe the Pharisees, we're not talking about the whole Pharisee party. We're talking about some of those Pharisees, and they were those who were connected at the time with the Jerusalem community, namely where worship went on up in the temple area. And those are the Pharisees. Now, interesting, because the Pharisees often did not have much to do with Jerusalem. Nevertheless, there is a certain connection that's here, along with the scribes. Now, we have noticed before, and before I go into that, let me say that Jesus here is pictured as talking to the crowd, to the group. And in a certain way, this is going to be, well, I don't want to say a contest, but it's certainly a kind of disagreement. Who should the people most be listening to in terms of what is the best way to live out life? Should they be following the teachings of the Pharisees and the scribes? Or should they look at Jesus as the new teacher? So in that sense, there is a kind of a contest. Now the scribes, and we have talked about them before, but just quickly to remember, were educated in Jewish law and practices. Their position was somewhat dependent at times on who the governing class in Jerusalem and in Israel were. The scribes functioned often in different ways, sometimes as advisors, sometimes as high officials, sometimes as bureaucrats, sometimes as judges, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as low-level functionaries. So, in that sense, they exercised a unique position in Judaism. In a way, they stood outside of the regular leadership of Israel at the time. In that sense, Jesus is an outsider too. And certainly, not to be offensive here, but he was a low-status male. He came from an out-of-the-way birthplace. His status, wealth, and literary technique were questionable. And so here, he now stands kind of in contrast to the scribes connected with the Pharisees in this case, and Jesus. Jesus, therefore, is an outsider, but and does not have the prestige of coming from the temple. But nevertheless, where does his teaching authority and ability and status come from? So with that in mind, we get this opening chapter. Now, it can be divided, and just so that you can kind of go and notice here how it works out as Mark has developed this, into 5 sections. All right, so remember, chapter 7, verses 1 through 5 are an introduction to the characters and the issues. Verses 6 through 8 is Jesus' first polemical response. Verses 9 through 13 is Jesus' second polemical response. Verses 14 and 15, Jesus then is pictured as instructing the crowds. And finally, verses 16 through 23, Jesus instructs all his followers. That would include, we assume, not only his male followers, but his female followers. We have mentioned on other occasions the presence of women in Jesus' entourage is not usually made specifically in the scriptural writings, but the assumption is that there would have been women as well as men in, especially in the group that followed Jesus and in the group that he is talking about. Now, there also had developed what I suppose we could call a great tradition and a lesser tradition, a little tradition. The great tradition was that which was practiced by the elites in the city. They could kind of work and live and experience life together. The little tradition were those that would have been adopted or adapted from the Greek tradition, but would have included peasants, that is, those who lived in the countryside, where water was not so available for ablutions. Now, I mention this because that's going to be the question that's raised here. And fishermen, their hands would be, perhaps dealing with dead fish, dead animals, other pollutants considered not to be quite so sanitary. Now, what happens here is that Jesus is questioned by the leadership as to why his disciples do not wash their hands before they eat. Now, we've mentioned before, this washing of hands is not what your parents told you to do before you sat down at supper. Did you wash your hands? That's not the way this was understood. It had to do with ritualism. And the great tradition, which was developed, as in this case, by the Pharisees, was that before they entered into any kind of religious experience, they would do appropriate ablutions or washings. And the challenge that is now made to Jesus is, why do your disciples not do that? Now, Jesus here is pictured as taking the attack. He does not just respond to what the objection is, but rather kind of goes against them. And in this section, he is pictured as quoting, by the way, a section from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 29, verse 13. He says, "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as if they were doctrines." So this is the argument now that Jesus is going to present against his critics. First of all, he says, look, you have this washing of hands kind of thing, but let me tell you a story that you honor. Remember, one of the commandments is to honor one's father and mother, to be careful for them. But you have an interesting practice. And remember, the argument here is the difference between what was the teaching that came down from Moses in the early tradition of the Torah, or what were additions that were made and were assumed to have the same practice enforcement as did the original Torah. You argue that you should be, and we mentioned caring for parents, but you say, no, look, when we have some extra money, we give it to the temple. It is called korban, and therefore once it is given to the temple, we cannot, as mom and dad, as we would like to maybe be able to help you, look, the money is gone to temple concerns, and therefore there's nothing that we can do. So Jesus' point is that care of and concern for parents is really being set aside in order to follow a practice which in some way was a human development on the part of the leadership. And then there was this further argument. Now, we're not sure to what degree this was actually the case, but the argument had been made by some that the money in the korban could be taken back again if their parents were deceased. Now, there Jesus is really making the case of a duplicity. You kind of, well, in a certain way, put your money in the bank so that you don't have to use it at the time that there is need for it. We're not quite sure whether that what practice was actually approved of by the Pharisees, so we do need to be a little bit careful about that. But that's the first challenge, if you want, that Jesus levies against his opponents. You make human laws and you keep them as if they were divine laws. Now, care for father and mother, as I mentioned, was very important, and maybe those who had argued for korban had rationally made such a vow just to get out of having to be concerned with their parents. So Jesus now argues against another time. Okay, so that's his first kind of notice, that he is taking the offensive here. We're not used to Jesus as kind of arguing. We always sort of think of Jesus as kind of, well, being very nice, compromising, seeing if we can't kind of find a simple resolution to this difficulty without having all of this tension. But here, Mark presents Jesus as really taking the initiative and going after his opponents or his contestants. I do also need to step back a moment to say that this kind of rapport between members of in groups like this was typical of the way in which Jewish argument would take place. You would present a case, and then the argument would be, now wait a minute, let's look at other sides of it. That would be okay, but Jesus here is not letting that happen. He is directly attacking. So now we come to the second argument. You're hypocrites. You say one thing, but you do another. Each of these questions that Jesus throws at his opponents, he does not step back and say, I'm going to give you a chance to reply. Jesus, when he calls them hypocrites, by the way, that's an insulting term. We've seen this before. You actors is the way in which it might be read in another way. Scripture may be the lines you quote, but it is not the script by which you live your lives. So in other words, he accuses them, as we in English sometimes have used the phrase, you say one thing and you do another thing. Or what we often find people saying, listen to what I say, don't watch what I do. But here, Jesus is challenging his disciples, or not this group, in front of the disciples, and hoping to, and you do get the sense as you hear the readings this time, that the crowd is beginning to side with Jesus. And that's exactly going to be the difficulty. If the ordinary people listen to Jesus, then their tendency to listen to those who are in authoritative position might be lessened. And that becomes a concern for them as Jesus' mission begins to unfold. The counter challenge that Jesus gives is that they value human tradition more than the Torah, more than the law. The fact that Jesus here has preference for confrontation and conflict and relies on insult rather than dialogue, tact, and diplomacy, as I mentioned, is something that is a bit unusual in the accounts that are remembered about Jesus. So all of that is a little bit of a background, and it concludes with an interesting section where Jesus makes the case that who creates food, who creates all things? God. And therefore, the foods that people eat, and in Jewish life, you remember there were certain foods that you shouldn't eat, certain foods that you could. Jesus, in effect, is pictured as some, and this is not really highlighted too much in the reading we hear Sunday, but that all food was created by God, therefore all food really is good. And in that sense, challenges the tradition of his time. Now he goes on to say, look, it's not what goes into a person that is important, but it is, when we think about it, what comes out of a person. What goes into a person, and you get a little bit of physical analogy here, goes into the stomach, goes through the body and comes out, where it comes out. So that's how food is digested. But it is what is conceived in the heart, that is in the center of a person, that is to be looked at and concerned. And what are the things that emerge there? Evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. So he gives all of those in verse 23. If there are any to be added, you can, for your homework, add one of the vices that is missing. So, and that would be the point that Jesus is making, or has been making, to the crowd, to the group, to the disciples and other followers. Look, the law is fine, but it is the spirit of the law that is important. With that in mind, and it is obviously, and you can see where this is kind of sensible, the good also that comes into the world comes out of what and how people act. So Jesus kind of changes the argument from external to internal, and I suspect we will have some reflection on that as we go along. The first reading this time comes from the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, you remember, is the fifth book of the so-called Pentateuch. Places a great deal of interest, actually, on the importance of the law. And in fact, the Deuteronomist is pictured as emphasizing the gift of the Torah as a gift that was received by Moses. Now, the book of Deuteronomy pictures Moses as speaking to the people as they're about to enter, that's the context of this, the promised land, in which he, having gone through the wilderness years, and they have now come to the threshold, Moses says, I will not be leading you in, but he now kind of gives his farewell talks or advice. And there are two major talks, addresses if you want, that make up this book. But the opening part, which is the section that we hear this time, is kind of a little conclusion and an emphasis on the importance of the law. Now, and so not to diminish it, Moses, of course, is preeminently in the scriptural tradition the teacher. He has, as we have seen his story unfold in other parts of the Pentateuch, made judicial decisions based on case law, on specific instances. And he says to the people, Israel will manifest to all nations their wisdom and intelligence if they do not add or subtract from the law. For fidelity to the law, to the Lord's statutes and decrees, is the condition for possessing the new land. And such observances alone can guarantee life for them. So that's kind of the message that is presented to Israel as Moses pictures they're ready to enter the promised land. It points out that the blessings of God can be classified in two categories. The first are blessings that are given by God freely, and there is no response required. And then there are blessings of God that are given conditionally, dependent upon fulfillment of certain requirements. And it's that point that is being made by Moses to the Israelites as they stand ready to enter the promised land. Things will go well things will go okay for you if you keep the law, if you keep the Torah. Law codes of other nations were perceived as collections or requirements meant to win the favor of the gods. So here's the distinction, that laws in the ancient world there were law codes, none quite as strong and as original as we've mentioned before as Israel's, but they did have law codes that the people put together, and the idea was that by getting these codes or laws together, they could appeal to the gods, and the gods would show favor to them, and things would go well for them. That's not the way this is done. The code here is developed by the Lord, and it is not that they receive favor by making laws, but they favor God by keeping the laws. See? So Israel's wisdom is found in the quality of obedience. Now I know we have to be careful because obedience, do we have to obey? But that would stand as Israel's wisdom to the other nations, that they would obey and follow a code of law which in many ways would demonstrate God's love not only for the Israel people, for Israelites, but also would be extended to all people. And therefore, that Israel, by its example, and that perhaps is the point that we might make here, that by their example of political loyalty, service, and fulfillment to the covenant that had been made with Israel by the law, by the Lord, and therefore was tricked out in the Torah, in the rules, would be an example to all of the great love that this God had, not only for the Hebrews, but also eventually, and of course this is picked up and extended in the New Testament time, to all peoples and to all nations. So, again, in listening to the law as presented in Deuteronomy, do not think of it, we should not think of it in a legalistic sense, that sometimes keep the rules exactly or else. But it was in observing the pattern of, and that of course is, remember, how the commandments were seen, how the Torah was seen as guidelines. See, that as a way to be the community of God, a way to be the people of the Lord, to give example to others and to other nations particularly about the generosity and kindness of this God. So that, I think, is trying to find a rationale for the reasoning that is given. Remember, always the first reading somewhat counterparts or enables or enhances some way of looking at the gospel tradition. So as the giving of the law was a demonstration of God's love for God's nation, thus the observance of the law should be done in that way, and not with the kind of human laws that were added. Now, in fairness, the Pharisees did develop a series of kind of ritual laws which they kept and which they found were important. And as and we can call this, perhaps as I started earlier on by saying, the great tradition. Did they impose this on everyone? Did they expect all? And remember that the Pharisees were the more popular teachers of the time. Expect all those who followed and heard their instruction to keep these rules with the same strictness and observance that they did, or not? Jesus challenges that. And again, as we hear this time, Jesus stands that the rule is important, but that the love of God, the carrying out of God's loving ways, are really the ultimate criteria by which things can be done, and that the way in which this comes is from the heart, from within. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.